There are dire warnings that New South Wales will be hit by increasingly extreme weather.
2015 was the hottest year since climate records began.
Figures show this July was the single hottest month in recorded history.
Australia sweltered through its hottest spring on record.
Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent.
It's the rate that's of great concern.
And what do you put that rate down to?
Oh, it's human activity.
We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
Hello and welcome to Climactic, a podcast on the Climactic Collective, a group of independent podcasters from across the range of the climate communities of Australia and New Zealand. Every week on Climactic, rain or shine, we either produce or feature an episode of a climate-engaged podcast. This could be from one of the shows on the Climactic Collective or beyond, and you'll always find a link to the show we're featuring at the top of the show notes. My name is Mark, and I'm the publisher of the Climactic Collective and of this show. And if you ever have any questions, I'm always reachable at hello@climactic.fm. I'm in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, New Zealand, Aotearoa, and I pay my respects to the iwi of Tamaki Makaurau and acknowledge their shared sovereignty over this land, as enshrined in Te Tiriti, the Treaty of Waitangi. Hello and welcome to Climactic, the flagship podcast of the Climactic Collective, and if you're listening to this on the day it comes out, congratulations, you made it. You're in 2022. I hope the weather's fine over there. I hope the water's warm. I hope everything is going swimmingly. As I record this, it's December 24th, Christmas Eve, and if you didn't already catch part 1, this is a 2-part episode. Today is the second part, so if you haven't listened to last week's episode released on Christmas Day, well, you've got a present waiting for you still under the tree. Go back and get it. Listen to that one first, and then you'll know what is happening in this episode. It is a panel from NonFictioNOW, which is an amazing conference of academics and documentarians, working people in the non-fiction storytelling space. Myself and 4 other podcasters got together to do this panel about how we use podcasting to talk about climate, and it goes into a bit of our backgrounds and thought processes, ways we use sound and audio. So I hope you enjoyed this. This second part is a lot more of our roundtable discussion rather than the sort of intros and the individual interviews from the first part. So enjoy, and if this does inspire you to get involved in climate-engaged audio storytelling in any way, please just let me know. Or if you want to contact any of the other panelists, just drop me a line at hello@climactic.fm. Also in the show notes is a link to watch this as a YouTube video, if that's more your speed. Alright, look forward to big things in 2022, or 20 take 2, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers!
All of us, in one way or another, do an acknowledgement of country at the start of our episodes. And I'm interested to talk about that because I feel like that's it's grown in the last 4 or 5 years, really, how common it is that people will do an acknowledgement of country at the start of an event or an episode of something. So, and I think that that's something that's pretty specific to Australia, maybe New Zealand, and maybe it's growing around the world, but I know that it's become quite common in Australia that we do an acknowledgement of country, which is basically acknowledging that we're living on and producing our programs from stolen land and Aboriginal land, and that there was no treaty, sovereignty was never ceded. So generally when people do an acknowledgement of country, they're just saying, I give thanks and acknowledge that this country originally belonged to these specific Aboriginal people. And if you know the name of that country, you'll give that name. And often, if you're really sort of like feeling it, you might give thanks for how the Indigenous people cared for the country before white people came or European colonisers came and took over. I would start my show with, I acknowledge that I'm on Jara country, home of the Dja Dja Wurrung people who've lived here for tens of thousands of years, and I thank them for the care they've taken of country. Sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And sometimes I link that into what's happening in the episode as well, so thematically. But I thought it would be really nice to, acknowledge where each of us is talking from for this session, and also give that context for people watching who might not know why we do this. So do you guys want to go around and acknowledge the country that you're on right now and maybe what's going on?
I am on Gadigal country, so the Gadigal means grass people, so you don't necessarily need to say Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, it's Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and that's where Sydney is in Australia. That is a lot of the kind of CBD area and a bit of the surrounds.
I'm on Gadigal Wongal land, which is the inner west, just a little bit further west from where Ash is in Sydney.
And how would you acknowledge that at the start of your show?
We gave an acknowledgement of country when Jess was in the mountains, so she acknowledged the people there, and I was here, but we also wanted to acknowledge Aboriginal people all throughout Australia and throughout basically deep time for what they've done in Australia, their legacy of sustainability and caring for country that has really like built up what Australia is today and maintained such an amazing ecology without which it would be impossible to see what you see here in Australia, you know. Big old rock.
I've just moved home back to Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's definitely not as prevalent here yet at all as the acknowledgements of the country as they were in Australia. Granted, in the last few months I've been able to go to as many live events, so there may be more than I've seen, but how I like to start my shows now is to say that I acknowledge I'm on the lands of the iwi, the peoples, the tribes of the iwi of Tamaki Makaurau, this area of Auckland, and that their sovereignty of this land is not only, was it not ceded, their sovereignty was enshrined in Te Tiriti, the Treaty of Waitangi, the founding document of New Zealand, and that, in fact, their sovereignty of this land is enshrined in our law and needs to be considered at every opportunity going forward in order to return to a sustainable way of living. And it feels good saying it. I get kind of this goosebumpy feeling of, as you said, Ash, of deep time, and I think it's so cool to kind of normalize that feeling where you might see something like that as sort of a documentary, but how often do people watch documentaries, whereas they might listen to a podcast every day or a few times a week, and if that becomes a super normal thing to hear, that's awesome.
I think, I'm, as I was saying, I'm on Gadigal Wongal land, just a little further west of where Ash is in Sydney, but I'm from a white settler family, about 5 generations in Australia, and growing up in Australia when I was, which is very recently, so much of this history is invisible, and to be able to hear and see examples in New Zealand where it is far less visible, and I think little bit by little bit there is a bit more visibility happening, but it just needs to be permeated through all aspects of our life, and be uncovering the language and names and ways of living and names of country, which very unfortunately in Australia has just been done quite poorly, to say the least.
Yeah, totally. And all of our podcasts are concerned with the environment, and so, you know, it makes sense that of all kinds of topics that podcasts would cover, that we would be acknowledging the people from whom the land was stolen. And
who lived here sustainably for tens of thousands of years.
Exactly.
You know, they lived here without, I mean, there's lots of interpretations of that. And Tessa, you're actually not in Australia right now. Tell us where you are.
Yeah. So at the moment I'm in Hawaii. I'm on the island of Oahu, which is, as everyone knows, part of the United States of America. But the Hawaiian Islands are quite similar to Australia with their history of colonisation, and the Indigenous peoples here still continue to face a lot of, roadblocks, I suppose, or hurdles in terms of language being used, which is very similar to what's happening in Australia with names of countries and language being actually made illegal from the schools. But I'm not sure if acknowledgements happen here. I haven't seen one, but I've been to a few blessings, which have been nice. But I will say mahalo to the Aina, which is land, and to the Moana, which is the ocean here in Hawaii and give my thanks to the beautiful Hawaiians that I've met so far. On my time here, I'm here for work, and they've really incorporated me into the aloha spirit of Hawaii, and they're just such beautiful people. And with my podcast back in Sydney, I pay my respects to the Gadigal and the Bidjigal people, which is along the coastline of the Sydney area. And yeah, I agree with you guys. It's of utmost importance to acknowledge the history of Australia and the Aboriginal people who have literally kept the environment so happy and healthy up until the point of colonisation. So you wouldn't, have a conversation about the environment and not acknowledge and involve them. So
I also really, just before we wrap this build up, I really see us Westerners with our European cultural heritage, if we could understand and start to become in tune with some of those Indigenous perspectives on how to live with land, I think that's actually our way forward. It's not just backwards looking, it's forwards looking to acknowledge Indigenous worldviews.
Yeah, important not to treat Aboriginality as an historical fact. It is a contemporary reality.
So to start us off, I want to pose this question to the four of you. And that is, as climate-engaged podcasters, how we think about this medium we work with, of podcasting in particular, of sound, and with trying to get our audiences into the headspace where they can think about the natural world and engaging with it, and in the face of a specifically nature interfaced topic of climate change. How do you approach using natural sounds in your podcast? Is it something you seek to do, you want to do more of, you're happy with how much you do? How do you think about that topic?
Should I jump in?
Yes, those beautiful bird sounds that come out of your podcast.
Well, I really appreciated the conversation, Mark, when you and Tessa were talking about that in the intro to Tessa's show. And I was thinking about how I hadn't really been conscious of introducing it, but I had just instinctively included natural sounds in my show right from the start. And hearing you talk about it really helped solidify why I do that. But I actually did it kind of unconsciously. And I do go and collect samples of sound. If I'm interviewing a person and it's on a particular topic, I will try and catch atmospheric sound. And my home studio is I've got the garden right next door. So often when I'm recording, there's just birds in the background anyway. But so for me, so far, it's been kind of incidental. But my intro, the music that I play underneath the intro to every episode, has my partner actually put it together. And he is an ecologist and he loves nature in all its forms. So he went out and captured some beautiful bird sample sounds and then put it together with some mellow music. And that just lays the groundwork for every episode and creates kind of a mood, which I really appreciate. But yeah, I think it's nice to think about bringing nature into such a tech kind of thing, and you don't know where anyone's going to be listening to you from. They could be on a train in New York City underground, or they could be, somewhere else. And especially as Australians and New Zealanders, I think a lot of our audience, we might get more people listening from elsewhere in the world, and that the bird sound or whatever context of this place is actually kind of beautiful and unique for them to listen to as well. Yeah. Did you guys put anything heaps better? Was that?
I'm honestly thinking of the dolphin sound.
Oh yeah, it was a sound effect. I think, but what's it was definitely not a natural dolphin. But I think sound and field recordings and sound design in a podcast really is there to give you a sense of place. And so I think when you hear your conversations, Allie, with people, when you can hear you can hear the countryside or the garden or the birds outside,
the chickens,
you get that. Yeah, you're immediately there, and you get a sense of place of where you are. Talking with somebody about soil, and you can almost feel the soil at your feet. And Ash and I, we didn't. I'm trying to think of actual field recordings we had, but what we did have was a lot of recordings of the places that we were in, which were touring around Greenpeace's warehouse or in a cafe together with cutlery and banging noises around, doing a power map. And so the way that we used, or it was that sound design, it was a dolphin and a floaties when we were in the water, struggling with what to do about climate action, which is a pretty silly. But what those sounds do is give you a sense of place. And so I think for the things like the cafe or being in the Greenpeace warehouse, or the things where it was more us, I'm thinking walking to the Greenpeace warehouse, just being idiots, going, oh gosh, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to do? Ash going, I feel like I'm in Legally Blonde and I'm just about to knock on the door. And I think it's those things which make you as you're listening feel like I'm there with these people. I'm in the garden with the birds and talking about soil, or I'm in this cafe with my mates going like, all right, let's like break this down. How can we figure out where we're at and what we can do? Or the sound design element is just a bit more like something to give you a bit of a smile. And yes, maybe you do imagine that you're struggling in the water with Ash and I in floaties looking like dorks, trying not to ask for help from the climate action lifeguards.
Yeah, watching the mountains of coal be just, carried past on giant coal ships.
Yeah.
Like to create vistas, it's helpful for us in what we're doing to get a sense of scale of the problem, and, what people are up against, and the fact that people are going up against this stuff anyway. So like in this example that we're using with the coal ships is like, this amazing guy from Fiji, Samoa, Fiji, Fenton Lutunatabua, and he is basically like dangling and watching all of this happen, and he's standing up to it, and so you can kind of put people in the shoes of an activist who is doing something really incredible, and rather than simply just talk, just create a visual. And then you can say whatever you want, but people have experienced something different for a moment, and I think that it's so much more powerful in terms of our podcast having so many parts to each episode, because we wanted to cover a lot, and so we're going from an interview with one person to an interview with another person to a chat between Jess and I, and trying to figure out what we're going to do next. So going on a journey, it really helps to have a locality to that journey and to have scene changes. And that helped us to achieve a kind of scene change. And then if you were then to listen to the podcast and reflect back on it, you might remember the places that you've been, and that can help you to solidify some of that information. So I think it actually helps listeners to have been somewhere, in the same way that I don't think I'm ever going to forget your episode, Alison, with the soil scientists, because I'm seeing you guys next to the chicken coop, and I can literally tell you the landscape. There's a chicken coop here, and then there's the soil tailings over here, and there's a directionality to all of this. You have to imagine it. It's like being in a dream.
It connects to imagination, which I think exactly what you said helps listeners put themselves in the shoes of these stories that we're telling, or the information that they're learning.
It's interesting in terms of non-fiction, because I think a lot of what people at NonFictioNOW, they're writers, and so this is the layer that podcasting can add. And Ash, as a filmmaker, the next layer is obviously the visuals. So podcasting sits somewhere between the written word and filmmaking, which means that we can be really evocative with sound, and then we don't have to use as many words because the sound's there,
my podcast actually doesn't have any sounds except for my very high energy jazzy intro, and then it's just straight into
it's so
me
good, and I love how
chatting.
fast it cuts. It's like done.
Now we're on. That was just because the first podcast, it is the first podcast I've ever made, and I'm not a podcaster. I'm an actress, and I'm an environmentalist, but I'm not, I have zero technical skills. So yes, that was just how it happened. It's just what ended up being. But the use of sound I enjoy thoroughly in every other podcast that I listen to, and it's definitely something that I'm inspired by listening to all of your podcasts and hearing the different ways you use sound. Allie, the beautiful birds and the kind of nature sounds, and then Ash and Jess, I feel like I sat at the table with the CEO of Greenpeace and his kids. I imagined that, and it was during COVID, and you said you had the COVID screen, and there was all of the kind of hustle and bustle of a family kitchen table, and I felt like I was there. I feel like I'm part of their family now in some kind of weird capacity. So yeah, it evokes so much, and it's so clever, and it's something that, for me as a first-time podcast maker, I didn't think about because I didn't have the skills, and I was only recording via Zoom, so I didn't, go outside and record anything. But it's something that I'm so excited to work with moving into season 2 of The Nature Between Us, because I can see now how much it gives to the listener through the narrative and place. And like you said, it brings emotion in, and that makes you kind of connect to it more.
Tessa, there's another side of the sound, which is your voice and you as a regular host, and a personality that we get to know when you listen to a podcast like yours. And it's, you very intimately got, your voice coming into our ears, and podcasting's a very one-on-one intimate format. And when it is a podcast like yours, the sound of your voice is the thing that we become really familiar with, and we get to know you, and we also get to know you as not somebody who's and the same, Alison, I think the same a lot of us, who's not somebody who's working within the environmental climate movement, but who's an actress, you've got your day job, which is in a completely different thing, and you're interviewing and connecting with all these people who might be performance artists, or they might be bakers, all these different people who are in their own realms, their own ways, doing something and connecting in and doing it in their own way. And I think that's a really important part of the sound, because you get the intimacy of those human voices, and you can connect to, like, even if it's the imagination of, oh yeah, that's like my local baker or my mate who's a nurse or an actress as well. So I think, what do you think about the importance of citizen journalists, or of people who are sitting outside of the environment or journalist or media sector, and people like us who are connecting with and asking these stories and not pretending to be any kind of professional the way that Ash and I were very clearly playing the fool, but to be having these conversations and being really everyday about it.
I think it's really interesting personally, because it kind of feels like you are getting a little look behind the curtain in a way. Certain podcasts that are a bit more, I had a friend who told me that his podcast, they don't cut out all of the kind of like all the kind of mishaps and the someone's goes off topic, or like, oh, someone walks into the room and la la la. And I thought that was interesting, and he was explaining that it was because the listeners actually, their podcasts have been going for a long time, and I'm probably getting off track here, but basically it made the listeners feel like they were getting a look behind the curtain. So it was less of a polished, here's our presented podcast on a platter, everything's been polished like everything else you kind of consume on media, and more of a like warts and all, like this is us, just like, it's as if, like Jess and Ash in Heaps Better, it's as if you're sitting at the kitchen table and you're eavesdropping on like really interesting people having a conversation. But to go back to your question, I think it's wonderful that we have the capacity, someone like me who's got absolutely zero background in making a podcast, I somehow managed to make one. So that literally means anyone can make a podcast and go out there and put it in the world. And hopefully someone will listen to it and go along the journey with you, because having the humility, like you guys said, to play the fool, I think is really brave. To be like, I don't know what this means. I'm going to ask the question, and I'm going to publicize that and publicly say, I'm confused about this facet of climate change, or I don't really understand what fracking means, or whatever, whatever it may be. So yeah, it's pretty exciting that we have these platforms that are so accessible, and technology is so easy now.
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? I think it is sort of accessible to everyone, but then it becomes like there's so many voices. You get people, it's sort of like that bubble where you could get to listen to people whose ideas are the same as yours. And like, I'm not trained as a journalist, and I don't think any of you are professionally journalists, but we have just come in and followed our interests, which is wonderful. But at the same time, no one's fact-checking us or the people we're talking to. And I find that a really interesting dynamic, because there are podcasts out there that have completely different points of view and millions of listeners. And you see this with the alt-right and the sort of spirituality movements and all this sort of stuff. They get so many listeners, and they're often linked to businesses that they're making money by selling courses or whatever. So podcasting can be used for good and evil. And I guess as citizen journalists, I think the other side of that is that we often feel so stymied by like the Murdoch media and who has power over what gets told to people. And podcasting is really liberating in that way. You have your own platform. No one's going to tell you what to put out there. So it goes both ways. And I wonder, Mark, if you've got an opinion, because you've done a lot of listening to political podcasting and news in general. Like, what do you think about this sort of balance?
The multitude of voices, the sheer number of perspectives that you can find through podcasting is great. So you can find, in the politics realm, you find, I'm going to pick a name out of my hat, Dominic Raab, who was like the UK's financial, economic secretary, whatever the term is for the UK, a few years ago. And I would have listened to maybe 50 or 60 interviews with this guy, Dominic. But he's being interviewed by such a wide variety of different hosts, all with different levels of background expertise and sort of reasons, what they're trying to get out of him. And you can't help, I think, but, that's why politicians are very good at this, right? But, you can't help but, when you're the subject of such a wide variety of questioning, to kind of let slip who you really are and make your best case sometimes and your worst case other times and say things you didn't mean. And it's just awesome having such a wide gamut and such a wide menu to choose from. And the fact there isn't fact-checking and there isn't yet arbiters or gatekeepers in place in this space, it's interesting, it's scary, it does lead to some bad outcomes and also some good outcomes. And it's we've got this weird moment where at the moment, podcasting is now big enough that you don't have to explain what it is anymore to anyone, but it's not big enough that there is these checks and controls in place yet. So who knows if that's going to be the case in 5 or 10 years? Probably not. But for right now, it's powerful and uncontrolled. So that's rare in the media, and it's cool that we can all play a part in that, and we're all trying to do good. I think even people who do bad think to themselves they're trying to do good most of the time, but I think we're all trying to do good. So that's it's an open field. So I hope people at NonFiction Now kind of take away that, it's here and it's powerful. You can use it.
I mean, I have to caveat on off the back of Heaps Better. It's probably one of the podcasts I've done where there was some pretty rigorous fact checking. It really had to go through quite a lot of rounds of getting it right. putting two people who were openly saying we don't know a whole lot about this and we're going to find out, and making sure that we found out the right thing, or portrayed the right stuff.
Totally. We had a lot of eyes across it because it wouldn't have been good for Greenpeace to have us be like, oh no, I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, everyone should definitely do this. This is a good thing to do. And it's actually no, that's a total freaking waste of time. Don't tell people to do that. It wasn't a podcast by Jess and Ash though. It was a podcast by Greenpeace made by you two. Yeah. Just a powerful difference.
It was a great collaboration because it allowed us to look like we said, to play the fools and to openly be foolish while, Greenpeace were our experts. We were by no means, we're not Greenpeace.
Yeah, but it still felt right. And I think that's kind of what I feel about citizen journalism is that, it was citizen journalism in the way that we came up with a lot of the ideas of things that we wanted to talk about and ran those interviews and stuff like that. And so I think it just makes it feel very accessible and fun, and the tone is right. And I think that with citizens journalism, I just go to what people can really fit into their media diet. And people don't want to be, on the hard news all day, every day. And they don't necessarily want to be on the long form all day, every day. So we tried to think about where something like this would fit into people's media diet in order to, make sure that the relevant audience would have space for it and be getting the kind of tone that they need from it and the level of entertainment and information that they can handle from it. Sometimes I feel like maybe the information there was just so much, but
Climate change is all about what will happen in the future. And as much as we've got amazing science supporting lots of projections, there's, and working at the sustainability group, I had a committee of management there who I could sort of fact check with, but actually at committee meetings, they would often have really different opinions about what would be effective and what needs to happen. So there is still, as much as there's a lot of really well-established climate science and a lot of really well-established information about what needs to happen around climate, there's also a lot of different opinions and a lot of people want to emphasize different things.
It's not
and
straightforward.
report in different ways. I mean, that's one of the questions that we were going to explore, is the types of climate reporting. So you've got human stories, you've got solutions, problems, activism. You've got so many different ways of telling these stories. So why did each of us come to our own position? And Tessa, we might start with you. So how did you come to decide on the format that you really wanted for the climate reporting?
I think purely just from a place of my personal curiosity and of ease of getting it out there. I don't want to say I'm an impatient person, but I do prefer doing something and getting it out there. I felt like I had some urgency. And so I think for me, just having a conversation, just kind of warts and all, and popping it out onto the internet and making that accessible and, editing it in a way that it was still succinct and not waffly, and that I didn't really take up too much of the conversation. It was more about, inquiring on a specific level. Each episode there's kind of like a theme that you kind of trying to demystify or understand deeper or but I mean, like I said, I don't come from a podcasting background, so it kind of also for me just seemed like the easiest way to get started and to get the podcast going. And I love podcasts that are just long form conversations. One of my favorite podcasts is called Water People Podcast, and it's Lauren Hill and Dave Rustovich, two professional surfers who are also environmentalists, and they're calming and they're long and they kind of meander, and I find it relaxing. So I think I gravitated towards that because of my lack of editing skills and sound design skills, but also just because that's what I enjoy, having kind of long conversations, and I enjoy listening to long conversations.
Yeah. I think mine's quite similar to yours, Tessa. I actually started thinking, I need to make it dynamic. My first few episodes you'll hear, I've got segments, I've got audio intros to each segment. I was going to have a recycling tip, everyone. I was going to have,
oh my gosh,
action
that's
things.
So familiar. This sounds very similar to what Jess and I were saying at the beginning. It's like, okay, cool. And then we're just going to have this segment and then this segment and then this segment.
Yeah. But actually, I got exhausted and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't actually keep up with an episode a week doing all these different segments with different people. And I ended up also just realizing that it made editing a lot harder. It made the show kind of choppy, and I think with more skill I could have done it better. But I ended up, I think similar to you, Tessa, I just feel like there's a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of, it's hard to get people to listen to climate stuff anyway, because it's difficult to hear. It's difficult to think about our own lives and how it makes us feel that we're collectively facing a future that's out of our control. We can't be like our parents who, if you go to university and get the job, everything's going to be fine and you retire at 70. We can't rely on that. And so people are already stressed out about climate and the immensity of all the things you need to consider and all the things that seem out of our control. And so I kind of wanted to do friendly, reassuring kind of episodes, but that simultaneously just helped raise people's awareness and continually just bring another thing in for people to think about week by week without it being overwhelming and without me being too strident or yelling at people or telling them they have to change their whole lives, because no one's going to listen to that. Some people might want to listen to it, but generally only if they're already doing that thing. And if they're not already doing that thing, they're going to go, oh, too hard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Hard. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that the way that most people choose what podcast they're going to listen to, unless they're a dedicated listener to a particular podcast, is by looking at the title and seeing what's this going to be about. Maybe they might look a little bit further into the description before committing to an hour-long podcast or anything like that. But the way that both of you have structured your podcast is that people can really get a good sense of what they're going to be in for. And so, I'll go through periods where I'm interested in the soil carbon sponge, or I'll go through periods where I'm interested in seaweed or whatever. And then you can be like, oh, great, this is a climate engaged person, talking to people with solutions. Let's see if I can find something on fungi,
Yeah, true.
And that's kind of how I browse. Yeah.
And when people are Google searching, often that's how shows will show up to them.
Yes.
They might only find us because we did that one episode. And Mark, I'm actually really interested in you because you've got a whole host of people in your network who, some of them are rank beginners and some of them are a bit more established, and you yourself run episodes. How do you decide your format? How do you decide, how have you seen other people navigate their shows?
It's the sampler pack. So when Climactic started, it was very much a lot like Tessa's show, where it was an interview show because that's where my skill level was at. And I knew I was kind of starting on easy mode and I was going to ladder up from there, where I very intentionally wanted to talk to everyday folks, have chats with them, just able to be me, just curious about what they were doing and really inspired by everyday people taking action on climate change, and then edit it just enough that they sounded as good as they could. So like you get rid of the gaps, you get rid of the indecisiveness, the moments where they don't know exactly what they're going to say. And then all of a sudden, the person who was nervous about doing an interview, and I was always so grateful to people in the early days who were like, because we got this thing in Australia and New Zealand, we all know of tall poppy, and people are like, they can be locking on to coal ships on the weekend and they don't want to speak to you with a mic in your hand because, who are they to speak? I'm not the leader of some group. It's like, no, but you're the most inspiring person I know. So just talk into the mic, please. And I wanted them to just hear themselves as the articulate, passionate people they were, and sort of get rid of any of the gaps or the moments where in daily human speech we don't sound like people do on podcasts generally. And I wanted to make sure it sounded like they were a person on a podcast, not being interviewed on the street and just put out unedited. What that became is like we tried to do an audio magazine, we tried to do a bunch of segments, and it was super ambitious and it fell over after a couple months. But one thing I kept to was the schedule of we release something every week, just because I'm as a listener, I'm a huge fan of consistency. When someone says they're weekly, by God, they better be weekly. So we've been weekly for 3.5 years.
Wow.
That's so amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that means it's no longer me. It's not my content, like I give the credit back to the people I curate. But what we are in format is like, I want to listen to something that's climate engaged. Here's a feed that has something every week, and it might be from the Climactic Collective Network, which probably is going to be an interview-based show. Sometimes it's not. But it might be an episode from something else out in the world that I've gone out and said, hey, can I feature that here, please? Can I expose you to a new audience? And they'll say yes, generally, because that's how podcasting works. You're not... The whole medium is time-shifted. You're never battling for the same slot as anybody else.
Point about how podcasting is maybe different to other types of journalism. When I'm thinking about my listener, I really know what switches me off from a show, from a podcast, and stops me listening. And I know there's this huge discussion there's two sort of camps within podcasting of the super loose, real time, whatever happens, you don't edit, you hardly edit at all. You might fix your levels a little and then you put it out there. And that's really great for some formats. And then others are very tight, very well produced. Some podcasts have got teams of like 10 people working on different elements of it. So it's vastly diverse in terms of quality and what the product is that comes out. And as you said, Mark, there's no time. Like coming from a community radio background, you have your time slot. And for me, that works because I need a deadline. I absolutely need a deadline. I made
one for me because I needed one too.
And my show still goes out on community radio, so I have that weekly deadline. But I know that podcasting in general works best if you stick to a regular schedule so that your listeners know, okay, on a Tuesday I can download the next episode of such and such. What does podcasting offer that's unique and awesome?
Accessibility. I mean, you can make a podcast if you've got, $300, you can cobble something together. And keep cobbling something together.
I feel like I have to jump in as a podcast producer and say like, don't undersell yourself. Like that makes me nervous when you say that because I feel like you can,
True.
but you don't. But like,
yeah, one model is just a dude FaceTimes another dude and they turn on. I love that you're bringing this up because I think that it's very valid. It's not that you're going to make the best podcast in the world with $300. It's that you can start putting content out. And that means that you can
do
just
it for
start.
Free.
You can exactly.
Yeah.
You can start making a proof of concept even if you you just want to figure it out. I know a lot of people who talk about making this podcast and they have this great idea and then they get intimidated by like thinking that it needs to be a certain way, and honestly they would have already made it by now if they had just started working with what they had and learned that way, and it would progress so much faster. I mean, it's very different if you're going to something that's production heavy. It's very different if you're going to be working with a team. It's very different if you're going to have any kind of sponsors or anything like that. But, a lot of people just turn on the Zoom chat and they record it much like we're recording this now. Yeah.
There's little P and big P podcasts, and not all podcasts are produced by people who are podcast producers. Some people are just having a chat and giving it a crack, and they can then become capital P podcast producers down the track. But yeah, like, don't get so stuck by indecision you never try anything. There's free hosting and free tools, and the reason phone calls sound bad isn't the microphone in your phone anymore. They're incredible. It's your bloody telco provider. You've got all the tools you need right now. Everyone does. And yeah, give it a crack.
And also, like as we were saying before, there's no gatekeepers. You don't need to get it past an editor of a magazine to get published. You don't need to get the approval of so-and-so and such and such. Like, you can just put things out there, and that can be good and that can be bad. Like, I think some people then feel completely lost about how valid they are. Like, some people need the validation of an editor to say, yes, this is worthy, or can you edit that grammar a bit? That's helpful. But you can just put stuff out there. Like, Tessa,
listen.
How much experience did you have? Like, had you done any audio editing before ever?
None. I edit my self-tapes, which is like an audition that you do and you send the tape off if you can't get in the room. But absolutely no audio. So, yeah, I have GarageBand on my Mac, as everyone does. And, I just watch a YouTube video. Huh?
It's a good bit of kit. It's honestly, it's all you need.
It's great. Yeah. I didn't even
Especially
have this Rode
interviews.
microphone. Honestly, I think the couple of interviews I didn't even have headphones on, which now I know is like the biggest no-no in podcasting. I've got these cool big headphones because I want to fit in, but I had no experience at all. I was purely just coming from a place of wanting to turn anxiety into action, and I had been running some documentary screening nights in Sydney with a friend, and then COVID hit and that all got shut down and we couldn't congregate together, and I was like, what else can I be doing? Because that was kind of scratching the itch of wanting to do something, like Jess and Ash were saying, off the back of the fires and the anxiety that we all felt. So yes, honestly, I can say this like with full heart, if I did it, anyone can do it. I had no experience. And, maybe that shows, I don't know, people probably listen to the first couple of episodes or even the whole first season and it is pretty rough. But I find with podcasts, if I'm interested in the people who are talking and I'm interested in what they're saying, I really I let go of bad editing.
Views, like being part of a conversation, it's a nice feeling to feel like you're actually part of a conversation rather than listening to a product. And, that's the feeling I get from both of your podcasts, Tessa and Alison, and even with Mark's work. If there's just a conversation happening, people understand the format of a conversation, and they're not going to impose these crazy production value ideas over the top of it. I mean, if people can't hear the audio, that's a problem.
Yeah, and there's a lot of free software out there, like you can download Audacity to do your audio editing if you want to do some audio editing. And Mark, you deal with a lot of people who are really new to podcasting. What sort of advice do you give them?
It needs to be as good a quality as, an average phone call. Because, think about it, you don't like the quality of a phone call, but if you're chatting to a friend, you will stay on that phone for an hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes, because what you're getting out of it's worth it. And we haven't talked about sort of the parasocial nature of podcasting. Well, we've touched on a little bit how you feel like you're a member of a conversation. You're just not saying anything when it's a great podcast, or you're a fly on the wall. So I guess we have touched on it a bit, but I'd say worry about quality second. I just want to quickly say on Tessa's podcast, like the quality is absolutely there. It's very listenable. And I was worried I was becoming a bit of a podcast snob when I just realized that, oh no, there's just some sound quality and sounds, random sounds, like Ash said in episodes, that make something unlistenable. And it's okay not to listen to something you physically can't listen to without pain. That's okay. But Tessa's show is like, from a complete beginner notwithstanding, it's good. And I was taking it on walks and listening to it just like I would taking my phone for a walk to have a chat with an old friend. And that length and that quality, that authentic character, that nature, that just straight into the mic quality is actually endearing and develops that connection you have. So that's what I recommend beginners. Just try, and yes, as soon as you think I can do better, please by all means do so. But
season 2, I have a friend helping me with the edit, so just stay tuned. It'll be better.
And there's endless information online. If you want to jump online and get some tips on editing or how to do anything to do with podcasting, there's heaps of tips online.
Transom's a good place for that.
And I think also that thing you were talking about just then, Mark, is so true. And it's specific to podcasting. Like when you're reading a magazine or an article in the newspaper, or you're reading something on your computer, or you're watching a movie or the television, you're locked into place. But you can take a podcast with you on a walk, while you're gardening, while you're riding your bike, while you're doing the dishes. That might be a bit loud, but it can travel with you, and you can do whatever other thing you're doing while you're listening to a podcast. Totally. So I think it really can slide into your daily life in ways like while you're driving a car is an obvious example of, being able to consume something like a podcast while you're doing something that you really need to concentrate on.
It's so funny that you say that, Alison, because I have become obsessed with listening to your podcast when I'm gardening. Particularly because it's, there's a lot of this vibe of like grassroots people in the community doing things, getting their hands dirty. And so I'm just like, just me and my homies chilling in the garden, just planting little seeds. Like, this is basic manual work that I'm doing, and it doesn't require that level of bandwidth. And so all that other bandwidth is taken up by this delightful conversation that I'm a part of. Aww. And I feel like that meme of the kid who is sitting in front of a little mini billboard, and there's all these girls kind of laughing to each other, and he's like, it's like me listening to a podcast, like my friends.
But it does feel that way. Yeah. It does. It really does feel that way.
True, because like we were saying before, you tap into imagination, and I think it gives you that imagination of space and scope and who these people are and where their chickens are and or what's going on in that place. While also, I can be looking out, even in lockdown, looking out my window. I'm lucky to have a view of some pretty beautiful trees out here, even in the middle of the city, or you can be, looking at nature and connecting to nature. I think is a really important part of that process. And a podcast that I've loved in a bit of a different space was Forest 404 by BBC Sounds, which is a really high production value climate fiction series. Cool. And really interesting. They follow each fictional episode with a small soundscape, natural soundscape, and then also a non-fiction piece around how nature, for example, listening to natural sounds and being surrounded by natural sounds is good for our mental health. But I listened to that series walking around the Botanic Gardens in Sydney, and we're very lucky to have all these beautiful public spaces even in the city. But walking around the Botanic Gardens and looking at these trees that we have in the gardens, and in this series, there's like this one last tree from the past, and they find recordings of bird songs, and they're going like, what is this sound? And that level of imagination, while also moving through these spaces, I think allows such an incredible thing to be happening. The sense of sound and the power of your imagination that is very different to other formats or other mediums.
How are we going for time? Like, how long are we wanting to talk for? Okay, great. Well, I'm wondering if we cut to our podcast recommendations, because you guys have just given some beautiful examples.
Thank you so much for that, Jess. We're going to pivot into talking about recommendations from each of us about what we particularly think the NonFiction Now audience might like to delve deeper into in the nonfiction audio and podcasting space. And I think that particular example you just gave, Jess, is a really good one, that it is a audio fiction from BBC. It's kind of the coming again of the golden age of the radio drama. It's back with podcasting. We've got audio fiction now is a huge thing, and the NonFiction Now audience might be thinking, yes, well, that's all fine. You can make up your stories. But the way that Forest 404 would use a fictional story and then pair it with a talk, and this is like a TED-style talk about the underlying science or understanding that is being expressed in that fictionalized episode of a larger serial narrative. It was a fantastic way to blend the two, and I think actually it's a blueprint for what more nonfiction now style audio could look like in future, where fiction is leveraged to better explain something that is nonfiction. Not that fiction and nonfiction are that much of a... There's not that much of a line between them anyway. That might be heresy.
That's a whole nother conversation, Mark. Don't go there.
Totally.
Podcast recommendations to reel us fully back into the nonfiction. I want to give a shout out to a new podcast from The Economist. It's very dry. It's very boring. It's not. I don't think it is. But like,
you're selling it.
It's as nonfiction as it gets. Nothing made up here. It's a show called To a Lesser Degree, and it launched just a few weeks ago. And it's literally like The Economist doing a podcast about foreign affairs or monetary theory, but it's about climate. And it's the same approach, it's the same rigor, it's the same on-the-ground reporting, but it's The Economist talking about topics like greenwash and climate finance, and it's delightfully dry and pragmatic and practical and ripped from the headlines because it's talking about today's news.
What's that called again? What do we search for?
To a Lesser Degree.
To a Lesser Degree.
It's a great title.
I love that also because I feel like The Economist is going to reach a particular audience that we will never reach, of people who read that magazine and prioritize money and finance and the economy over everything else. And as we all know, so often politically, climate is pitted against the economy as if we can't possibly rock the economy for the sake of climate. So that The Economist is doing that is brilliant.
And to drop a quote of, there's an old saying that the only people who believe we can have infinite growth on a finite planet are madmen and economists. And that was a quote raised in that recent episode of this show from The Economist while talking about the ways that, maybe capitalism should be reformed.
Wow. So good.
It's happening.
Willing to recommend the BBC one, People Fixing the Planet, because it's very British in style, but, it's good because they do have some kind of on-the-ground reporting and some sound design, but they're, giving you the facts, and they're doing it in a reasonably conversational way. But once again, it's going to capture an audience that maybe slightly differs to maybe our immediate audiences. So it could be, like my mum would probably enjoy listening to it. They're quite on the ball with getting stories as they're coming up in a sort of like trendy way, like when seaweed trends or when fungi trends, or and then finding really cool people, because with the BBC they had the ability to do that, to find people that might otherwise not be found.
I've got one that's come out of Africa, which I heard about through the Jackson Wild Awards, which is a really cool American sort of awards system for filmmaking largely, but they've recently added podcasts. And the winner this year of their inaugural podcasting awards was called Guardians of the River. And so I had a listen, and it is what I think podcasting can really be in terms of really well-crafted narrative, people's voices and storylines interweaving, and the sounds of the jungle and the sounds of a busy city in, Africa, Botswana, wherever they're located, and because they sort of move around the Okavango Delta region, so it's a huge region of Africa, and the voices and the stories are really diverse, and they sort of have a theme. It's like a really well crafted TV series where every episode is its own storyline. So one episode is looking at elephants and one episode is looking at like the wetlands. It's a beautifully crafted, if you want a really nicely crafted one, which also takes you outside of, for me, any experience. I've never been to Africa. You hear a lot about Africa, but it gives you the nitty-gritty of some of the politics and the voices and the people and the dynamics of what it is. And then it throws in these gorgeous details, like the entire delta is rich and fertile because of termites. And I love that fact. So termites over millions of years have eaten little tunnels through all the mud of the river delta, and that allows the silt to come in and the water to flow under the earth. And that allows for this intense, rich, beautifully fertile region. And I just love that, like these tiny little details, as well as this bigger story that's human and natural and everything. So yeah, highly recommend it. That's called Guardians of the River.
It's a podcast called Water People podcast, or Water. Initially the podcast is called Water People Podcast, but then there is a sub podcast called Watershed Chats, and it's not specifically about climate, but it's about ocean and water and people that connect with water. So it's hosted by two surfers, Dave Rustovich and Lauren Hill. So there is a lot of surfers. I'm a surfer, so I connect with that on like a personal level. But I find that these conversations that they're having with all of their guests, it's kind of long form, ultimately end up tapping into environmental issues. And, you know, there is kind of the larger conversation of climate change that is there, but it's not so on the nose, which is one of the reasons I really enjoy the pod, because it's quite relaxing in a way, because you're hearing about dolphins and you're hearing about, you know, all these kind of like very relaxing, like interesting stories or anecdotes or facts. You know, a lot of scientists and really clever people are on the pod. So that's my recommendation. But the Watershed Chats are a little bit more science focused, so they're great as well. Yeah.
I understand we've got, as a final recommendation, to go full circle, back to Jess.
Yes. Also, Mark, you can edit this out for time if you wanted to stick to BBC Sounds. The last podcast that I want to recommend is fairly recent. It came out mid-October 2021 this year. And it's a 3-parter on the Guardians podcast called Full Story. The series is called An Impossible Choice, and it's voices and stories from families and communities in the Pacific looking at how climate change is literally changing their way of life in their villages and their homes, and the very human aspects of climate change and climate justice.
I want to thank you all so much for your time on this panel. It's been great. For Allison and I, the great privilege of asking the three of you to come along. You've all said yes, and that's just great. And it's been so much fun doing this over the last couple months. It's a shame we can't all be in Wellington together to present this and take part in the rest of the NonFictioNOW community, but I'm sure that the audience of this, if they have any questions about podcasting and audio, and especially, you know, for climate engagement, our details will be findable in wherever they're watching this video, as well as our podcast and everything. But I just want to thank you all so much, and
thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. This has been so nice. Yeah, it's just so nice. I feel like, I don't know, this is how I feel when I listen to your podcast. I'm just like, oh my God, these are my people.
Yay. Yeah, I know. It's really nice. It's been great.
Yeah.
And it's been nice for me to connect with other podcasters. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone. Thanks Mark. Thanks Allie. Nice to be a part of it. Thanks for involving me, a newbie.
Now you're not a newbie anymore. You're a professional.
Oh, you really?
I got a big P.
Yeah.
Run with it.
If you publish an entire season of your podcast with no previous audio experience, you too can join a panel for nonfiction now.
Oh, incredible.
The Climactic Collective.